Okay, I think we're good. So, like I said, yesterday I went through and I wired all of this up, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and comment it all out, and we'll work through it together. So the first step here is going to be adding in our XML, right? Or adding in our data for our users. So in the context of if we had a database, we would just do this using insert or update methods. However, since we're not using databases yet, I'm going to use XML. And what I've done is I've just created a users.xml. Sorry, it's a little, there it goes. So what I've done is I've created a users XML file with a parent node being users, child nodes being individual users, and then subnodes being full name, ID, password, and username. And the reason I've added an ID field is so that when we go to transfer this into our database later in the semester, we'll actually be able to map that directly into the DB. So think of the ID node, and the same thing is happening in cars.xml. Think of the ID node as a primary key on a table. So first, I'm going to go ahead and just add a new user in here. So I'll add a full name. I'll add an ID. I'll add a password. And I will add a username. So the next step here, there's a few different paths we could take. Let's work from the presentation layer down. So the next step that we're going to take is to actually go in and create our login form. So one of the things that I'm sure you guys might have been curious about was, how do I conditionally render something based upon whether a user is logged into the application or not? So the cool thing about JSF is that we really don't have to do a whole lot to make that happen. All we really have to do is create a panel group, and specify in the rendered attribute a session variable. So basically, JSF, as you know, we can specify beans using our dot notation, right? So I could say, all right, from this bean, I want the login message. From this bean, I want the login method. However, we can also specify session variables just by passing in the name of the session variable. So in this case, what we'll do is we'll specify if not empty user, so if the user session variable is not empty, I want to render this panel group, which is this set of components. And we can also apply this to navigation, right? So I have logged in navigation bars, I have unauthenticated navigation bars, but for this context, we just want to show and hide conditionally our login form. So we plug in the panel grid, and in this case, this is what the user is going to see when they're logged in. So we're just going to say H3. Actually, let's say P welcome user. So what we're doing now is we're just saying welcome and then grabbing the username from the session, which we'll store in the login bean, which I'll get to in a second. But we also want to specify a way for the user to log out. So we're going to go ahead and create a new form inside of that panel grid. And remember, anytime we create a command button in a facelet, we have to enclose it in a form. Otherwise, we never actually submit it to our managed bean. You guys remember what managed beans are, right? There are a couple of wrong answers on the quiz. I just want to... It's a model of our UI. I'll go over the quiz on Monday or Tuesday. So now we'll just specify a command button inside of that, and we'll say action is equal to our login bean logout method. And then value is logout. Okay, so that's our panel grid. So now that we've added a panel grid for when a user is logged in, we now need to add the equivalent for when a user is logged out. And so in this case, we'll just create the panel grid and say rendered when the user session variable is empty. And then I'm actually, instead of typing this, I'm just going to grab what I already had written up. So inside of that panel grid, we create a new form, and we specify an output text for username, and then we specify an input text that maps to the login bean username variable, or member variable. We do the same thing with a password, only this time we specify an input secret, and an input secret is just a password or a hidden text input. Finally, we specify this output text right here, which should, assuming everything is wired up correctly, map to any kind of error messages we get on login. And then finally, we specify a command button with the action that maps to our login bean login method with the value of login. So let's go ahead and redeploy and then load it up and see what we see. Okay, so it's been reloaded. So now on our home page, we see a username and a password field. Now, I've already coded all of this up, so hypothetically I could log in. But for the sake of argument, let's dive into our login bean and start working our way down the technology, or through the architecture, to wire everything up. So inside of our beans package, side note, for those of you guys following the GitHub, I've added just a couple more packages. I've added an exceptions package for custom exceptions. I've added an XML package for XML classes, and basically that's a loose term I'm using. An XML class is our data transfer. Basically maps our DTO class to our XML. It's a utility class basically. So if we go into the login bean, you can see I've already coded up my login function, but let's walk through the code and understand what's actually happening here. So first, we want to go ahead and instantiate a faces context, and this gives us access to the context of our application. So then the next thing we're going to do is, at least for the login, we're going to attempt to, and this is it's kind of ugly, but basically what we're doing here is first we're attempting to do the login. And so we're grabbing the username and the password of the managed bean and passing that to a method inside of our login service called doLogin. So if we step inside of that, what is this method doing? Well, first it's instantiating a variable of type user_DAO. And then what we're doing is we are calling the getUserByUsername method. And then we're validating, okay, does the user password, or the user that matches the username supplied, right? So if I type Rick into the username and I type password. So we get the user Rick, but now we have to validate, does the password entered match the password that's actually stored for Rick? So we're doing a simple comparison here, If it's successful, we return the full name of the user. We could also return the username or the ID of the user. For display purposes, I'm just going to return the full name, or simplicity as well. If the password doesn't match, but we are able to get a if the password doesn't match, but we are able to get a user, we throw an invalid login exception. And an invalid login exception is just that. It's like a 4-line class. Otherwise, we can assume that we didn't get a valid user, in which case we throw basically user DAO. Let's step into this method real quick. So basically what this method is doing, so the get user by username method, is iterating through all of our users. Not the most efficient way in the world. When we go into SQL, we'll actually be able to write queries to get single users, but for right now, an iterative approach is fine. Obviously, at scale, this would be terribly ineffective if you have an application like, say, Twitter with millions of users. Every time a user goes to log in, we certainly don't want to iterate over millions of users. But in this case, it's fine. So we get all the users, and we iterate over them, and we just do a check to see, okay, is the user that we're looking at, the password of that user, does it match the password of the does the username of the user that we're looking at match the username that we're searching for? If it does, return the user. Otherwise, throw out a user not found exception. And this exception basically is saying, hey, you're trying to get a user with this username, that user doesn't exist. I've also added a couple other utility functions in the user DAO class, like get user by full name, which allows us to search by full name, get user by ID, as well as an add user method that we'll clean up here in class. And then this is our get all users method, which also needs to be cleaned up. As you can see, the method to get all users is actually calling, it's actually parsing the XML in the old style. So we're going to circle back and clean that up in a minute. But let's go back to our login service. So all of that's happening on the do login. If we step back to the login bean, basically less is happening on our logout method. So on our logout method, all we're doing is we are getting a faces context and then getting a session map, which is basically a map of all our session values, and then removing the session value for user. So that way the next time the page is rendered, we will see our panel grid for our login again. So if we go back to our web page itself, now that everything is wired up, if I enter my username of Rick and my password, and I hit login, so this brings us into the login. We get our faces context, and basically what this line is doing is trying to put a new user variable with the value that we're getting back from our login service. So remember, the login service returns the full name of the user. However, the login service throws an exception if the password is bad or if no user can be found matching the specified username or username password combination. If that happens, we handle the exception, set the login message, and then return home, so back to the home page. Otherwise, if the login is successful, we want to reroute to the cars table. Oop. So the login was successful. You can see now our username or our user's full name is displayed up here. And if I go to do the logout, like I said, basically the same thing happens. Not the same thing, but basically now we just remove the session variable and we're back to our login page. So using that knowledge, we can also code up conditional navigation bars. We can restrict certain, we could even restrict certain areas of the site entirely. I'm not going to get into anything like that today. Obviously, we can cover that later in the semester. For right now, we just want to get a high-level overview of how this works. So let's dive back into our DAO class, our user DAO class, because this needs to be cleaned up just a hair. Or actually, let's do this. So, oh, how do I want this? So, as you saw, I had to manually add a new user. Obviously, that's not ideal. So let's code up a form to add a new user and then write the XML parsing and handling on the back end as well. So the first step is going to be to write our form. And we'll add that to forms. Create, create user, and then header. So where's the? I'll grab the one for parentheses. So obviously, first I'm going to update my XML namespace in here. And then, was it? It was in the name form, right? So I want to add the header. So I want to make sure I insert the header. And I want to repeat the process and insert my footer down at the bottom, just for sake of being consistent. So, creating a user. This is something that we obviously don't want to let anybody be able to do, right? So, what would we be able to do to restrict that? In a very simple context.
User like set a variable, so there's like an admin level user and there's a user level user. Just restrict it to admin level.
That would be one solution, yeah. What you could do is we could also do a check. So what we could do is we could set a session variable with the role of the user. So when we do a login, we could set a session variable for role and say admin, basic, power user, whatever. But for the sake of the really simple example, let's just use a panel grid and do the same check that we were doing in the header, right? So we just want to make sure we're only rendering this if the user session variable isn't empty. Unless we want to add in groups as well. What do you guys think? Do we want to do an example with different levels of user access? Oh, okay. That works too. So, side note, basically how to do what he originally suggested with the groups would be to just add a group role or a group node to our XML. In the case of a database, we would probably want to foreign key that to a groups table. But in this case, we can just, we could add to our XML or our CSV a group entry, and then just do an equality check to see what's the value of the group or the role node, or the role session variable, I'm sorry. All right, so now we'll go ahead and create our form. And then we'll do some basic input, right? So we'll say H output label is equal to full name. And then we'll do an H input text value value. So you'll notice I've specified this create user bean, but we haven't built it yet. So that's okay. We'll circle back once we finish the form and actually add in the bean and wire everything up. So then we will repeat the process and do the same thing for username. And for password. And for password, we want to make that an input secret. Now, what's the one thing that I'm missing based upon the user XML? I haven't specified an ID. Now, why is that? Well, assuming if we were using a database, we would auto-increment the ID. However, in this case, we're gonna do kind of a workaround for that, in that we're going to just get the highest ID in our XML and just add one to it when we create the user. So the last step here is going to be create a command button. Action equals what do I call that? Create user form dot create user, and then value Okay, so we'll save that, and now we need to go in and actually create our new, we actually need to go in and create our bean. And I'm going to change that to bean. So the first step here is going to be annotate the class and specify that it's a managed bean. For those, this was question on the quiz. So to register a bean with JSF, we need to annotate it with at least managed bean and specify name, which is what we'll reference that bean with in our JSF. And then specify either to be true or false. I'm just going to specify true for simplicity. So then I need to go in and add my properties, or my attributes, member variables. So we'll say private string full name, private string username, private string password. And now I'm going to go back and annotate all of these to be managed properties. And we just say value using the same syntax as we use in our JSF. So pound, open brace, close brace, and then param, and then full name with the name of the variable. So obviously we're still missing something here. We need a create user method, and we need getters and setters. So if I do a control N, I can generate a getter and setter for all of my properties. And then I can also generate I could generate a constructor, but then I also want to create my create user method, which I called create user. So what needs to happen in the create user, or what needs to happen in the create user method. What's the first step I'm going to take to add my user to my XML? Putting the cart before the horse. So before any of this happens, we need to create a user service class. Because remember, we want to separate out our presentation layer from our business logic layer to our persistence layer. So now I'm going to step into my service package, and I'm going to create a user service class. If I can spell. And I'm just going to create a couple member variables here. Actually, do this in the constructor. Oh, what am I? There we go. So I created two member variables. The first one being my JAXB context, which we'll use for. Actually, no, that should happen in DAO. Whoops. So disregard that. So first, we're going to create a method to create a user. Realistically, we would actually want to write the interface first and specify everything that we would want this class to do. So we would have a create user method, we would have a delete user method, we would have an update user method, we would have a get groups for user method, all of these different things. We technically could combine the login service and the user service class, but for right now we'll keep them separate. So we'll say public void create user user. So inside of this class, now I want to call the DAO class, so my user DAO. And conveniently enough, inside of DAO, there is a method called add user. So I'm actually going to go ahead and make this guy a member variable of my user service class, and I'll say user DAO, and then I'll go ahead and generate a constructor as well. That's not what I want. Equals new user DAO. So now what I'll do is I'll simply say this, user DAO dot add user. Now remember or maybe not remember, but the add user method has the potential to throw a JAXB exception. So inside of our user service class, we can do a couple different things. We could wrap this method call in a try catch, or we can throw it back up to the presentation layer. So I want to actually have some feedback for the user, so I'm going to throw it to the presentation layer. And I know what you're thinking, oh, we're just going to throw the exception and crash the site. Not exactly, but we'll circle back to that. So technically we fired everything up and this would work. But I don't want to do, actually no, that should all be fine. Yes, so that should actually all be fine. But one thing I do want to change is, so remember how I'm getting all of my users by actually calling my XML utility, grabbing the file, parsing it, adding all of my users to a list. It's really inefficient. So instead of doing that, let's rewrite this getAllUsers method to simply use to simply use JAXB to do all of our XML processing. So I'm going to go ahead and kill all of this except for, whoop, I'll go back, no. Except for returning users. And in fact, I don't even need to do that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to specify a JAXB context as a member variable to this class, right? So I can do it individually in each one of the methods, but why would I do that if I can reuse a member variable? And what do we call this guy? JAXB. And then I have a file object as well, which I want to make a member variable also. Private. So I need to generate a couple things here just for standard Java practice. First, I'm going to create a constructor. And that constructor will just initialize both of our member variables. Equals and in this case, I'll just handle the exception accordingly. So I don't want to throw, on the constructor, I don't want to throw anything back up to the service class. So then I'll also say this file is equal to file. Commented that out, didn't I? Ah, crap. That's what I actually wanted to keep. Okay. Now, how do I initialize a variable of type JAXB? So I have to specify that I'm creating a new instance of a JAXB context with the users class. Now you notice that I haven't said anything about the users class yet. That class is that XML reference class or XML utility class I was talking about a little earlier. So inside of that class is where I'm actually doing all of my mapping from user elements or users to XML. So when I create a JAXB context class, basically I want to annotate with @root XML or @XML root element. And then, so that just says, okay, the name of this class, which is users, corresponds to my top level node, my XML, i.e. users. I could call it whatever I want. I could call it cars, I could call it fish, I could call it fruits. And then the other thing that I want to do is, so I want to map my DTO object to my XML. So how do I do that? I create a new list member variable of the DTO object I want to pull from XML. And then I annotate that with the @XML element and give it name user. Now, the cool thing about JAXB is that it's going to do all of our mapping and all of our node creation and node reading automatically. So inside of my user DTO class, I have username, password, full name, and ID member variables. So what JAXB is going to do is grab the name of each one of these and actually read it from or map it to, when we write, our XML. So that's where that mapping is coming into play. Now let's go back to our user DAO, and inside of the constructor we still need to handle that exception. So Alt-Enter in IntelliJ will give us that suggestion list, and then we're just going to say this file is equal to new, or is equal to a file object created from my users.xml. One side note, I want to correct something I said Tuesday. If you guys recall Tuesday, I said that if you wanted to grab XML, store it inside of web app, inside of web INF. So that's actually, I was incorrect on that. We actually don't want to store it there. We want to store it in a separate location. Although it is a lot easier to grab when pulling files, we actually don't want to store it inside of web INF. We want to store it in a separate location. Which is why if we go back to user DAO, I'm actually specifying the full path in opening a file object. We won't be using XML utility anymore because we're going to use JAXB, so we can forget anything that we talked about regarding that on Tuesday. Okay, so now that all of that is added, we still need to update our getAllUsers method to actually grab all of our users objects. So with JAXB, it's pretty simple. So really, all we have to do is, in fact, do this right here. And so what are we doing right here? Well, we are creating an unmarshaller object, which is unmarshalling, or basically separating out our classes from our XML. We're specifying our file, which is the XML file that we're doing all of our mapping to, and then we're getting a list of corresponding user objects, and see, we're casting to user. So when we call getList, JAXB knows, or I guess Java and JAXB know, that when we're calling getList, that inside of the users class, there is a list object, or a list member variable, that will put all of our users in. And actually, you know what? I don't want to, that'll screw everything else up, so let's do this. So see what I did? See what I just did there? So when I added the JAXB exception to the method signature, did you guys see how it broke all of the other methods I'd written in my class? What was that? Yeah. So that's the beauty of the interfaces. Had I written my interface for this first and known what exceptions were going to be thrown, what exceptions I wanted to handle, I would have been able to create my other methods around knowing what I need to account for. So I could have specified my interface, oh, this will throw a JAXB exception. Okay, so in my other methods, I knew, when I implemented my other methods, I knew, okay, this throws a JAXB exception, I need to account for this. So the interface is basically like a contract. It says, all right, so this says it's going to throw a JAXB exception. I have to account for that. Because we don't know where where that method is going to be called elsewhere, we have to assume that that method is never going to change outside of the interface, or the implementation is never going to change such that it doesn't match the interface. But we'll talk more about that next week. So all that to be said, I'm actually going to go ahead and surround this with a try catch. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to nullify the users and then return my users variable. Now, what's the problem with what I just did? So I created my user list, and I I set it to null, and then inside of my try catch, I actually assign a value to it, what's the problem with what I just did? What could possibly happen if that tries to grab my users and it fails? Well, I would get a null pointer exception in my service layer, yeah. So I just want to come in here and do I just want to create an empty array list. That way, worst case scenario, the file got deleted, the file is unreadable, we still return something and we don't crash the application. Okay, so nothing is redlining, which is good. So then, okay, we've cleaned up that. Let's jump back to our user service. So our user service still looks good. So now we're going to go back to our create user bean. And now we're actually going to specify, now we're actually going to fill in our create user method. And so this one is pretty easy. We're just going to say user service equals new user service. User service dot create user. Now, couple things that we still need to touch on. The first one is going to be we need to create a new user and map that to our properties. User equals new user set full name equals this dot full name user dot set username equal to this dot username. Password this dot password. Okay, so now we've created our user object and we've specified all of the attributes except for ID. So that we're going to want to step back into our DAO class and add the configuration for auto incrementing our user ID. So we'll say user. We'll surround that with a try catch. And then we'll go ahead and step into our create user class. So we don't need to do it at the service layer, we don't need to do it at the service layer. We probably want to do it at the DAO layer. Of course, hypothetically, we should probably do the auto incrementing because it's logic inside of our service layer. So let's actually do that because we don't want to have to, we don't really want to do a whole lot of logic inside of our data layer. So let's jump back to service and we'll say list users equals this dot user DAO, get all users. Comparator. Oh, I just did this Tuesday. Don't drop your phone in water. Especially your company phone, because it's really hard to get a replacement. Holding out for the iPhone 8. So, they actually say it should be pretty neat. They're saying.
Did they say that it was going to be the 8, not the 7S?
So supposedly, there's a lot of different rumors. There's a lot of different rumors floating around. One of them is that there will be an iPhone 8, and then there will be an iPhone 7S. So like the iPhone 8 will be the souped up, ultimate. Yeah. They actually do have price points for it. So they're saying I think $11.99 for like the top tier, which I think comes with 512 gigs of memory.
Wait, memory?
Not memory. RAM.
Wow.
Storage memory.
Yeah.
So I'm a grad student in CS, and a lot of times there's a crossover of people saying memory when they mean storage. So
I was like,
it's just
oh, man.
the more languages and more topics in computing you look at, the more the terminology varies. So it's like I'll say MVC at one point, I'll say three-tier architecture. That's why when I'm going over the layers, I'm like, well, this is our view layer. No, this is our presentation layer. So, anyway, there's also talk that that phone will be called the iPhone edition. So it'll be like iPhone edition is the souped-up model, and then there will be a 7S. So I think the only thing they can confirm is that there will be a 7S. They haven't decided. They haven't come out with the naming convention yet. Anyway, back to what we were doing. So, comparator. Sort. And we'll say, what is it? New comparator. Okay, yeah. Okay. So in this case, we'll just create a custom comparator, and we'll just so we'll do integer compare 01.getID 02.getID. So if this returns, so if this function sorts my user array list or my user list in ascending order of IDs, all I really need to do is simply do, okay, for my current user, I'll say user.setID is equal to users.get users size minus 1 plus 1. Wait, what doesn't this like? Oh, I see what I'm doing. Okay. Get ID plus 1. So basically, I've sorted them from in ascending order by user ID. I get the last object in that array, so the one with the highest ID. I get the ID, and then I add 1 to it and set that to my new user. Now, one thing to keep in mind is I may have this inverted. This may sort it in descending order. So I might end up with 2 users with ID 1. Now, when we get into Hibernate, Hibernate will be able to validate that for us. So if we try to add something that has a duplicate ID, it'll actually fail because we're hand creating this, or we might run into some issues. So I went ahead and dropped a breakpoint right here. Now I think that should be everything I need. I'll go back to my create user form just to make sure. And I'll go ahead and, yep, okay, that should all be good. So I'll save, and I will redeploy. Okay, so we're redeployed. And I'm going to just remove these breakpoints here. So I want to go ahead and log in. So I'm going to log in as Rick. So that's that. That's, remember at the start of class when I talked about that login message. So basically what I did, since we saw it, basically what I did is when that invalid login exception is thrown, I set the login message value to the custom message I've written for that exception. Hence the writing the custom exception in the first place. So I throw a custom exception with a custom message that I want to display back to the user. Not really great for debugging purposes, but for visual purposes, awesome. So I'm going to say, if I can remember his password. I remember mine. Okay. So I was able to log in. So now I'm going to navigate to faces, forms, create user.xhtml. Did I get that mixed up? If not, empty user. Okay, so that should be right. Oh, that's weird. Let's just remove this since we're kind of pushing for time here. Redeploy. Oh. Okay. So I've taken the authentication out of this user creation form. We saw how to do it, pretty easy, but for the sake of getting this done, we're just going to fill it out. So full name, and then let's add a breakpoint in here just to be safe. Create user bean. Create one right there. Okay, so now we're looking at our create user method. So if we take a look at our member variables, you could see we've got our full name, our username, and our password. So if I just flip through that, I set, I create a new user with username, password, and full name, and then I step into user service create user. So then what I do is I get all my users. You could see that pulled back 3, which in this case are actually sorted already because they've been added to the XML. So the sort function, regardless of what it hypothetically do, at this point would be unnecessary. But when we start deleting users and start getting things out of order, that's when we'll see some real value. So then what we'll do is we'll just step over that, and it did our sort. It looks like our sort was successful. So now, if I did everything right, if we take a look at our user ID should be set to 4. So then we step into our add user function, which technically needed to be cleaned up since I added member variables. But we create our JAXB context, we get all of our users, we add a new user to that list, and then we finally write the XML. And if I go back to my web page, we're still thinking apparently. Huh, okay, so it didn't redirect. But, so now, if we go into our XML file, yeah, it doesn't format it when it writes it. It's yeah, screw it. Put it in, I don't care. Although it does keep the white space in the text values. Yeah. So a command, Control A, Command A, and an Alt Control or Alt Command if you're on Mac, plus L will actually go ahead and reformat that for me. So now if I scroll down to the bottom, you can see I've added a new user object with my variables. So, any questions? I know I just threw a lot of information at you guys. Comments? Concerns? Anything I didn't cover that I said I would cover in class today? No. What else do we want to try to we've got about 12 minutes left. Do we want to try to work through the role example? Okay. Cool. So let's do this. Oh man, I gotta update all my XML to do this. Damn. So role admin role basic.
You purposely get rid of the XML.
What was that? Oh, I did. Yeah, I didn't mean to. ID equals 3. Good catch on that. Role basic user. Okay, so now that I've added a role, what do I need to tweak in all of my other layers to make this match? So let's think about the DTO object first. So DTO object maps to each one of these user nodes. So I've added a new child node of user. I need to add a new member variable to my user DAO class, or DTO class. Now realistically what I could do is I could even map this to a constants file somewhere. That way our role names are static, right? That's something we can go through and update later, but for right now we just want to crank it out for the sake of getting it done. So go to the bottom, create a getter and setter for role. Alright, that's there. So then I want to check my corresponding XML to make sure I didn't miss anything. So that's all good. Check my DAO. The add user should be fine. Now the one thing I'll need to do, I know that the DAO is good. I know that the service is good because all the service does is call a DAO class, and then do my little bit of logic. So now all I need to do is update my create user form to have a role field, and I also need to update my bean. Role. So then I go to my create user bean. I add a new managed property for role. I go to the bottom. I apologize, I'm whipping through this. We add a new getter and setter for role. So then everything should be wired up. So now, when I create a new user, now I can add a new role, or I can add a role as well. At some point, since I've added at some point I would want to add a create role form, and I would want to have, basically for every data type I would want to have a form to create a new one, or edit or update or whatever. But for right now, I don't really care too much about that. So what I now want to do is I want to restrict display based upon user role. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and update my content. So I'm inside of home.xhtml, that's our default homepage. So now I'm going to come in and add a panel group, and I'm going to say rendered. Oh shoot, now I got to remember how to do this.
You just be group and then the group name.
I believe you're right. Yeah, well it would be group, and then I think equals admin. I think that's it. We'll see if it works. I know it's yeah, I believe that should be, yeah, that should be it. Because I don't, yeah, it shouldn't be double quotes. Okay, so P for admins only, and then I'm going to add another panel group for basic users only. Oh, role. No, you're good, and that actually reminds me, so we do need to update one more thing. And we've got 7 minutes, so we're going to be really pushing to get this done. So, remember what is returned from the login, right? So remember when we do a login, we just return the full name of the user. Well, if we're going to set both a username variable and a group variable, we can't return just a string. We have to update our methods to return a user object so we can get both the role and the full name. Again, this is a case where interfaces would have come in handy, because I would have had to think ahead and think, is there ever going to be any other thing that I want to get from this login? So I would say, maybe there is. All right, I'm going to return a user object. Implementation returns a user. Maybe I don't need everything. Maybe I do. So now, we have to go into the do login, and we have to update our method signature to actually return the username, or to actually return the user object. Pretty simple, but then here's the other piece of this that I have to do is now, since I'm returning a user object, I'm actually going to create a user object in my managed bean so that I can say user.getFullName role get role. Okay, so now, assuming I've wired everything up, I should be able to redeploy. And log in. So now I see my for admins only. It's showing up there twice, but I think I know what the problem is. Okay, yeah, so I added the panel group in there twice. So then redeploy. And then who did I give basic user access to? Rob Zombie, okay. Rob Dragula login. Okay, so now I see for basic users only because I've logged in with a new user and I changed the role. So now if I log out, so that actually didn't update because well, that didn't update. Why do you think that is? Close. I actually forgot to remove my session variable on logout. But had I done that, for basic users only would have disappeared, and we would have seen just the header and footer. So, makes sense? Any questions? Okay. So like I said, the quiz is due at midnight tonight if you haven't already done it. So you've got another 8 hours. Try to do it. I know I'm dropping the lowest grade, but it takes 2 minutes. Just knock it out. Next week we'll start going over interfaces and stubs and JUnit. Otherwise, have a good weekend and we'll see you Tuesday.
Got a question.
Shoot.
When I was messing around with some of my own project.
Yeah, sure thing. Do you care if I multitask?
Yep, that's fine.
All right, go.
It's an easy one, I think.
Okay.
When you're navigating between pages, default it is set to forwarding, and you can set it to redirect. Why would you ever want to do forwarding instead of redirect? Because I get all confused when I'm looking at a page and it says the previous page name in the URL.
Yeah, that I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay.
There's a lot of weird stuff in Java like that. I can look it up
No,
and
yeah, I just-
dive into it for you and actually give you an answer Tuesday.
Yeah, that's fine. I was just curious why it's default to that because I would always